Ah, the 90s. The odd little time between the heavy-hitting horror franchise and the weird, primitive, CGI-fueled remake fest that was the early 2000s. Thankfully, we made it through, and looking back, to be honest, there were a lot more bangers in the 90s than we thought. We all know the big boys, so let's take a look at some of the lesser appreciated flicks in the age of grunge and Crystal Pepsi. It's time for the top 5 underrated horror movies from the 90s, part 2. Coming in at number 5, we've got John Carpenter's Vampires. The synth-shredding directorial legend is no stranger to public praise. John Carpenter introduced the world to Michael Myers, and after that, nothing was the same. Sure, he had some bumps along the way, like The Thing being critically panned and studios not always letting him do what he wanted to do, but in the end, his output can't be considered anything short of legendary. But there are some flicks in his filmography that don't get the love they might get if they were put out by somebody other than Carpenter. A weird theory, and a little paradoxical, sure, but some of his less known work might be better remembered if somebody else took credit. People love hidden gems, you know. One such movie is Carpenter's spin on the classic blood-sucking monster we all know and fear. Vampires. More than probably anybody else, John Carpenter knows cool. It's at the base of his being. He can take anything and make it super stylish, super gnarly, and I'll say it again, super cool. He's got the touch. Take the opening scene. A rowdy crew of some of the most rough and tumble looking outlaws rolls up outside a dilapidated old house. They spend 5 minutes gearing up with an array of modern vampire hunting weaponry and then storm the house. In doing so, they manage to fight off a variety of the freaky, superpowered vampire people, fire stakes through hearts, drag the night crawlers out kicking and screaming, and then watch them literally explode into super hot flames. It is a sight to behold, and that's just the beginning. Give that intro to another director, and you get something half as entertaining with way less pyrotechnics. After a long day's work, we get a hilariously over-the-top motel party, and a scene where somebody gets ripped in half in the most gruesome way possible, followed up by a car chase involving an even more juiced up vampire. And again, this is only about 20 minutes in. The rest of the movie consists of James Woods and Daniel Baldwin being ill-tempered vampire killers, all while dealing with a dorky Padre and a rapidly turning Cheryl Lee. Add in some wild vampire lore, an insanely ornamental cross, and a pack of master vampires dwelling in an old ghost town, and you've got a wild ride from start to finish. Who else but John Carpenter would fuse elements of the classic genres, Western and horror, to get a product like this? Coming in at number 4, we've got the Lawn Mower Man. Alright, so this one might seem like a weird pick, and really, it is, but hear me out. This movie is underrated in terms of how audacious it was, how shameless and ridiculous, how wholeheartedly, unabashedly nonsensical, and for that, it deserves some respect. We should remember The Lawn Mower Man not for being a good horror movie, or a faithful adaptation of a Stephen King short story about a tiny naked man who comes to your house and eats all your grass. No. We should remember it for deciding to ride the coattails of a world-famous author and then do something totally bonkers with his name and IP. Have you ever looked at clips from this movie? Soaked in all the crazy CGI and VR futurism implications? It's an experience, I'll tell you that. And the story is pretty far out there too. Instead of sticking to the strange tale King wove in his short story collection, the folks behind the film took it to a whole new terrifying place. A scientist is experimenting on virtual reality and psychoactive drugs, which obviously can only result in chaos. He's a relatively good-hearted guy and wants to help the world with his discoveries, but the company supporting him just wants a bunch of chimp soldiers. Enter Job Smith, the intellectually disadvantaged groundskeeper. Why not take advantage of this man just doing his best and use him in experiments against his will? So what if we break his mind and ruin his life? It's for science. Also, take in the fact that they made him a groundskeeper so they could continue using Stephen King's title without actually using any part of his story. The fact that this movie exists is a miracle. The terrible early 90s computerized special effects are a time capsule like no other. And incredibly enough, there's a sequel. What a world we live in. Coming in at number 3, we've got Ghost Watch. So a lot of folks may be unfamiliar with this 90s newscast classic because it was exactly that, a newscast. On Halloween night 1992, the BBC aired a spooky, purportedly live report from a house believed to be haunted. There were some promos for the Halloween special, but a lot of folks just tuned into the BBC as per usual, expecting some news. The ensuing investigation into a ghost-ridden house ended in chaos though, as many BBC personalities ended up falling victim to the Phantom. People watching didn't realize that it was all scripted from the start and began to panic. they actually managed to take down the BBC switchboard, as it was estimated that over 1 million calls were made that night. Some praise, some complaints. So what actually happened during this TV movie madness? Well, a bunch of BBC reporters went out to a house that supposedly had some presence haunting it. At first, the reporters don't take the claims very seriously. They treat it as a bit of a joke and are obviously pretty skeptical. They interview the residents of the house, including some young children and their mother. As the night goes on, they ramp up the action bit by bit, culminating in an attempt to contact the spirit. And as it turns out, the spirit's real. His name is Pipes. And by broadcasting all of this to the rest of the world, the reporters have accidentally started a sort of national seance, which gives Pipes a considerable power boost. To the horror of everyone watching from outside of the house, he begins to rampage, dragging a reporter into the darkness and making his way to the BBC studios. Once there, he possesses the lead anchor, addressing the audience directly. It's a genuinely creepy broadcast, all done up as a regular news program. Since airing, it has gained a bit of a cult following and is now considered an excellent example of horror filmmaking. But because it was a one-time BBC special, a lot of folks don't even know it exists. Coming in at number 2, we've got Cherry Falls. Thanks to its proximity to other 90s teen slasher movies, Cherry Falls was unfairly decried as just another schlockfest. It was released in 2000, but it was filmed in the 90s, so we'll give it a pass for this list. Anything that twists the classic tropes we all know and love into new grotesque shapes gets a nod from me, and Cherry Falls does this with aplomb. Instead of the classic have sex, get killed method, we're introduced to a killer who will only slash the unsexed. And the backwards premise is only the beginning. In fact, it was so strange and so largely upsetting to the censors at the time, the MPAA rejected it multiple times before eventually gutting it and allowing this gutted version to be aired on TV. I mean, I get it. America's always been squeamish about sex, and this movie makes you face down a high school orgy meant to protect kids from the virgin murderer. The flick is absolutely packed with twists and turns, so I don't want to spoil it too much, but what I will say is that nowadays, Cherry Falls tends to get more comparisons to Twin Peaks than Scream. Take that as you will. And finally, at number 1, we've got Castle Freak. In my eyes, Stuart Gordon is a largely underrated director. Most folks are aware of Reanimator and maybe From Beyond, but after that, it's only the big genre fans that seem to have a real grasp on his stuff. Along with Brian Yuzna, he revolutionized the Lovecraft adaptation and did a whole lot of wicked stuff on his own too. Space Truckers, anyone? If we're gonna discuss stuff that's underrated and from the 90s, Castle Freak has to lead the charge. Loosely inspired by The Outsider with some elements of The Rats in the Walls, this isn't just a horror story. It's a story about a man's desperate search for redemption and how one's view of oneself can hugely affect your lives and the lives of people around you. It's also wildly gross and disturbing. Shot on location at a castle in Italy, it's a gorgeous little flick with plenty of architectural charm and local flair. The story is that of a family irreparably damaged by the drunken father's reckless driving, inheriting a castle and traveling to see it. Dwelling deep within, a freak awaits, tortured endlessly throughout his life by the castle's previous owner. The freak breaks free of his shackles and witnesses his own visage for the first time in decades. He's got the mind of a child, but the body of an emaciated freak, and wants nothing more than to be accepted as a human. But he quickly turns to violence after a series of embarrassing and horrid interactions with people around the castle. He just doesn't know how to deal with people anymore. Plenty to pick apart here thematically, but also a very fun time for anybody simply interested in gnarly kills and gruesome special effects makeup. Castle Freak. So, underrated, rated, overrated? What do you think? Sure, it's mostly opinion, but I think these are 5 quality selections that don't get enough love. Well, 4. I added the Lawn Mower Man in. What's an underrated horror movie from the 90s that you love? Are there any that get too much attention? Make sure you let me know down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more incognito ones from the top 5 winter SCP monsters part 2. Raven Draven says, check out the Volgun, because he did an episode on the Yule Man. The audio logs they made for it are unbelievably creepy. It's a must watch. We love the Volgun over here at top 5. If SCPs are your jam, definitely check it out. Ad Hoc Shaj B says, why can't they set the person on fire and walk them through the SCP? They'll be warm and spottable. You know, we might never know for sure, but I'm going to assume it's because most human immolation results in death. Onion Man says you have to make a song or something with Keegan's bloopers. Well, who's good with auto-tune? Oronk says, I'm glad I'm in Australia. I mean, you'll miss out on these winter wonders, but you'll get a whole lot of other creatures to worry about. And Warfare Fox says, lol, I thought you were gonna show my comment from the last SCP vid. Well, didn't happen last time, but today is your lucky day. And that's all the time we have for today. I'm going to consume thousands and thousands of apple seeds to see if the cyanide can catch up with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. It's at the base of his being. I feel like my hat's off center. Let's fix that. We're good. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know, Chris. Hey. We should remember The Lawn Mower Man not for being a good horror movie, or as a faithful adaptation of a Stephen King story shortly. Whoa, what is happening here? I wrote this sentence too complicatedly, but I'm not giving up on it. The story is that of a family irreparably